Good afternoon from Lisbon. It was already a month ago that we last met for a very long but successful meeting. I am sure you remember it. I certainly do. The hard-fought balance reached in that meeting has set the stage for swifter and more operational meetings, such as the one today. Long meetings pave the way for bold decisions. We are implementing our agreement on the 3 safety nets for workers, for businesses, and for sovereigns. Leaders have endorsed our plan and set a target date of 1st of June to make them operational. We are getting there in time. The Eurogroup ministers and its deputies have been working hard to flesh out the ESM-based safety net for sovereigns, the pandemic crisis support. In the meantime, work is progressing well on the 2 other safety nets in the Council and the EIB. Today, we agreed on the features and standardized terms of the pandemic crisis support to be provided by the ESM. We also confirmed that all ESM members meet the eligibility criteria to assess this safety net. Let me go into some more detail. The size of the instrument would be 2% of individual member state GDP as a benchmark. Member states requesting support will commit to use this instrument to finance domestic direct and indirect healthcare cure and prevention related costs due to the COVID-19. There are no other strings attached to the use of the facility. Let me stress that there are no other requirements attached to the use of the facility. This commitment will be detailed in a pandemic response plan prepared on the basis of a common template that we have also agreed upon today. After accelerated procedures to grant pandemic response support, the facility will be available on a precautionary basis for the member state concerned for a period of 12 months, which can be extended twice by 6 months. Disbursements will then be available on request. Reflecting the exceptional nature of the crisis, we have agreed on favorable and adequate financial terms. These loans will have an average maturity of 10 years and carry a low financing cost. Monitoring and surveillance will remain proportionate with the particular challenge of the crisis, meaning that it will focus on health-related expenditures. We are therefore far from the sovereign crisis style of monitoring. We are setting a termination date for this instrument at the end of December 2022, but this could be adjusted, either made shorter or extended if the crisis is more prolonged. It's on us to make sure this is not the case. The next step is the formal confirmation of our agreement in the ESM Board of Governors, which I would expect to happen well ahead of June the 1st. Based on our current plans, the confirmation could be already on May 15th, subject to the completion of national procedures. I stress the timing here because we need these backstops to be made available as soon as possible. With the Commission's economic forecast discussed in the Eurogroup today, we were reminded of the urgency we are in and the urgency of these measures to be on the ground. The economic outlook is very telling of where we are, and it underpins everything that we have been doing as finance ministers and in the Eurogroup in this crisis. The dire forecast for this year confirms the scale of the challenge. For instance, a gap of 850 billion euros in investment, which we must address. For that, we need a robust recovery plan for Europe. On our 3 backstops go a long way in leveling the playing field for the emergency phase, but we need to do the same for the recovery to protect the single market and the European project. We will come back to these in our meeting of next week. I also reported on a couple of G7 calls in which I participated on behalf of the euro area. Global economic coordination is obviously crucial in times of crisis. These calls are also an opportunity to explain to our economic partners how the euro area is responding to the crisis. When we compare with our partners, I should add that Europe comes out as particularly forthcoming, both in size of its response and as in speed of decision making. We also touched upon some ongoing files unrelated to the crisis. We discussed the updated draft budgetary plan of Austria. This was mostly a procedural point. We also heard about the 11th post-program surveillance mission for Portugal, which I am glad to report went very well. The efforts made by Portugal during the last few years to strengthen economic fundamentals will help to tackle the current crisis and support a swift recovery. Let me conclude precisely on that hopeful note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Commissioner Gentiloni.
Well, thank you. In fact, we had a positive meeting of the Eurogroup, as Mario said today. I presented also the spring forecasts of the Commission, the key findings, a deep and uneven recession, followed by an incomplete and again uneven recovery, a real risk of worsening divergence, which could undermine the single market and the euro area, and a strong case for a robust and common response, very high uncertainty and risks skewed to the downside. We appreciated the convergence of analysis of our spring forecast with that of the European Central Bank. Our main objective today, as Mario said, was to agree on the pandemic crisis support of the ESM, and that objective has been achieved. Let me underline three key points. First, on eligibility. The Commission published yesterday the preliminary assessments on debt sustainability, financing needs, and stability risks in cooperation with ECB and ESM. The economic and financial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic entails important risks for the financial stability of the euro area. At the same time, the economic and the public finance situation in the euro area member states is fundamentally sound, and the debt level of each and every one of them is sustainable. This is the conclusion. As such, the conclusion is positive regarding the eligibility of all euro area member states to benefit from this support. And I welcome the fact that the Eurogroup concurs with this assessment. Second, on conditionality, I think that we could not be clearer that there is only one requirement to access this credit line, and Mario quoted it literally. Third, and linked to this, a word on monitoring and surveillance. As we made clear in our letter yesterday, the Commission intends to apply the requirements setting out in the EU law in a streamlined way that reflects the nature of this symmetric shock and is proportionate to the features and use of the pandemic crisis support. So to request access, member states will have to present an estimation of their direct and indirect healthcare cure and prevention costs linked with the COVID-19 crisis. When a member state draws funds from this credit line, The so-called enhanced surveillance that the Commission will carry out will focus only, I repeat, only, on monitoring the use of the funds and their coherence with the scope. There will be no additional surveillance missions carried out. In short, one condition and streamlined monitoring related solely to that condition. Full stop. Once this agreement is fully endorsed by the ESM governing bodies, we will, I think, have added a very useful instrument to our crisis response toolbox. Then, of course, it is the sovereign decision of each member state to decide whether they wish to apply for this support. The European Council has requested that this package is potentially worth more than €500 billion be operational by 1st of June. And I think that today we have taken another important step towards that goal. As you know, the Commission is working on the next step of this common crisis response, a revised proposal of our multi-annual financial framework, together with a well-funded, strong recovery plan. This is a complex exercise, and I hope that we'll be able to come forward with this proposal very soon. Lastly, we had a brief exchange of information on this week's ruling of the German Federal Court, Constitutional Court. And the Commission recalled 2 points. First, as we have also earlier this week, that EU law has primacy over national law in our common legal order. And as the Court of Justice of the European Union recalled today, the Court of Justice alone has jurisdiction to rule that an act of an EU institution is contrary to the EU law. And second, that the European Central Bank is an EU institution and its independence is the basis for monetary policy making in the euro area. That independence is beyond question. Thank you.
Please, Klaus Régling from VSM, please. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everybody. So this was indeed an important meeting. Let me start with a few words on Portugal, because that is an important part of our work. Portugal, one of the countries that borrowed from the EFSF, so we need to go and always analyze whether there are risks to repayments to the EFSF. And although the mission took place in February, which means the data that are in that report are outdated, it was still an important mission because it was the opportunity to take stock of the positive developments in Portugal last year, including the fiscal surplus for the first time in many, many decades. And that has an important effect even now, where the general economic situation has deteriorated so much. And we can see that by the fact that Portugal has maintained very good market access. So we, as the largest creditor of Portugal, don't see any risk for being repaid in the next few years. On the forecast, the Commissioner talked about that, but I wanted to make one remark that, in my view, this is a very balanced forecast, prepared under very challenging circumstances. There's huge uncertainty. There are big risks, as the Commissioner said. But I want to make two important remarks here. One, that without the measures that have been taken by our member states and also at the European level, the economic situation would be even much worse. So I think we have to remember that these tremendous amount of measures taken are really important to limit the damage. And the second remark is that the European measures, the measures taken today and offered by the ESM, by the EIB, by the Commission with the SURE program are designed and will be implemented to compensate for the fact that the national measures are asymmetric. And I think that's really important to protect the single market and also to avoid divergences in the euro area. Then a few words on the ESM's pandemic crisis support. The president of the Eurogroup and the commissioner have already talked about some of the details, but I'm very pleased from the ESM's perspective that we have come to a positive conclusion in record time. When I look back the short period of time that was needed to forge a consensus among the member states. And I'm confident that after the national procedures next week, the Board of Governors can make the pandemic crisis support mechanism operational a week from today. I want to thank our partner institutions, the Commission and ECB, for very good cooperation. Otherwise, this would not have been possible, and also our member states, of course. Today's agreement shows that Europe is ready and able to act to address this crisis that is without any precedent. Money from the pandemic crisis support can be made available rapidly to cover healthcare costs, and the money will be made available at very low cost given our top rating. The costs will be only marginally above zero. A member state that decides to draw from the credit line will commit to use the money for direct and indirect healthcare costs, and this is the only condition, as has been said before, but I want also to confirm that point because it's politically so important. There's no other condition attached to this facility. And each member state can benefit from the support in the volume of 2% of its GDP. If all member states were to draw from this facility, which I do not expect, of course, but if all were to do it, this would add up to 240 billion euro. The loans provided will have an average maturity of 10 years, so this will allow to spread out over a long period of time the costs related to the coronavirus. Again, to end, I can repeat that the Board of Governors meeting will meet a week from today. That is the highest ESM decision-making body and will make the facility operational after the national procedures have been done. And this would be 15 days ahead of the deadline that the heads of state and governments gave us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now pass on to the questions. The first question I have is from David Carretta from Italian radio.
Yes, thank you. David Carretta, Radio Radicale. First question is a technical one. What is the reference here for the 2% of the GDP limit? I guess 2090, but I like to check because it could make a huge difference for some member states. A second question to President Stenteno and Commissioner Gentiloni. Would you advise member states high debt level and high interest rate to ask for this facility and use national budget on other measures and avoid the divergences in the recovery? And finally, to Mr. Rέgklingg, I understood that the cost will be marginally above zero. What would be the interest rate today for member states if they request a credit line? Thank you.
David, could I ask you to repeat your first and second questions, please? Because the sound was not very good at the beginning and I missed it. Could you please repeat?
Yes. First question: what is the reference here for the 2% of the GDP limit? I guess 2019, but I would like to check because it could make a huge difference for some member states. Second question, more political. Would you advise member states with high interest rate to ask for the facility and use national budget on other measures so to avoid divergences on the recovery? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for having you repeating the questions. The 240 billion, which is the size of the instrument, is computed with figures for 2019, but maybe then managing director of the SM can confirm this. So this is the 2% that this instrument has as reference. In your second question, this is a safety net. This is indeed an instrument that is very important. It works like an insurance instrument to guarantee market access, to improve on the conditions of countries to have market access, to assure also those markets that we have an instrument for a just-in-case event. And this is the way we have to deal with it. I mean, of course, as I mentioned in my introductory statement, this instrument has very interesting financial terms, very favorable, both in terms of maturities and in terms of interest rates. Just for you to have an idea, if you compare it with the normal ECCL, you have a 50 basis point savings in terms of the costs of the financial costs of this instrument. So I think now we will continue responding to the crisis, taking the necessary measures. It's almost 4 trillion euros in state guarantees, automatic stabilizers, discretionary measures that we took already, and we need to create these financial safety nets around us to take care of the financing of these instruments. Let me, to finalize my answer, which has already been quite long, that is an important issue around this instrument, and there is no stigma for any country. It is available for all countries. All countries are eligible. There are standardized conditions to access it. There is no sort of troika type of post-accession surveillance, and this is very important to stress at this moment. Thank you.
Yes, I can confirm everything the President of the Eurogroup just said. In addition, on the specific question, indeed, the GDP that we will use to calculate the 2% potential access will be the year 2019. This is mentioned explicitly in the statement of the Eurogroup tonight. I don't know whether you have it already, but if not, you will find it there. On the third question, the way we charge loans is that we look at our own funding costs, which are determined by our rating, which is the top rating, and that's around 0 at the moment. Of course, that can fluctuate, but at the moment it would be 0 plus the relevant margin. And again, the President of the Eurogroup explains that it was decided today to reduce that to a lower level. This is also mentioned in the statement of the Eurogroup tonight to have full clarity. It's in the footnote on page 2. So at the moment, it would mean today that we would charge 0.1% on the loan. But as I said, it could go up in case our funding cost goes up. But that would be the situation as of today.
Thank you very much. Let me just confirm that the statement is indeed published and available. So if you haven't received it by email, you will find it in the website. The next question is from Susana Freixas from Express and SIC Portugal. Susana?
Okay, thank you, Susana Freixas, SIC and Express. Actually, I would like to understand if the question of the presidency was discussed today in the meeting, and if you already decide, if you already made your mind, Mr. President, if you're going to stay or not, and if you confirm what is being said today in a new German newspaper, that you are really leaving from the presidency. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it was not on the agenda and it was not discussed. My mandate ends on July 13th. The Eurogroup decision to elect its president should be taken no later than in the July meeting. That's what we are looking in terms of the sequence. I will take and communicate my decision on whether to run for a second mandate in due course, and it did not happen yet. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of work to do at the moment, and I am focused on my job, which, as everyone can understand, is extremely demanding in these crisis times, and this is my only focus right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question, Marco Bresolin from La Stampa, Italy. Marco?
Yeah, good afternoon. I have a question for President Centeno. If I'm not wrong, the reason, the annex with the template for the eligible costs, I'm wondering if there is an agreement on the list of the eligible direct and direct cost, if there is an agreement between the governments. And if I may, a question for Mr. Rέgklingg. I read in the statement that the ESM will implement its early warning system to ensure timely repayment of the loans. Does it mean that the ESM credits will have a sort of priority on the other credits? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, all details were agreed, so we agreed on everything, and maybe the managing director of the ESM can add something to this, but the information is, as I mentioned before, that all documents, or all the relevant documents, will be published as soon as possible by the ESM.
Yeah, that's correct. It will be published, I think, later today. And that will also give a table which actually was designed and prepared by the European Commission that will show the categories for the healthcare expenditures, direct and indirect. So there's agreement how to handle that monitoring job, because that is the one condition that is agreed. We will look how the money that comes from the ESM will be spent in the country on direct and indirect healthcare costs. The other question was on the early warning system. That's different from our preferred creditor status. The early warning system is our approach to follow developments in the countries that borrow from us. It's nothing to do with conditionality. We just need to be informed about the economic situation to analyze whether there are risks to servicing the loan. And I talked about that earlier. We had the example of Portugal today. So we will continue to do that also in other cases. Separate from that, indeed, the ESM has a preferred creditor status. that is written down in the ESM treaty. That means that if there were any problem, indeed, the ESM should be serviced first. By the way, only the International Monetary Fund has a higher status above the ESM, but then it's the ESM. And that is widely recognized. This is nothing new. This is also the case in other cases that received ESM loans, like Greece and Cyprus. It's actually one reason why it's important that the maturity of our loans is relatively long, 10 years, because it would only be relevant for private creditors if they have loans that run longer than our own maturity, which is not very frequently the case. Thank you.
Commissioner, would you like to add something here since we mentioned the templates?
No, I think that it was really an excellent job, and that all was agreed. In fact, we are working on details, but I am sure that we have also national procedures before the Board of Governors on next Friday, but the agreement today was really a complete agreement on all aspects.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, Sam Fleming from the FT. Sam?
Hello, thank you very much indeed. I wanted to ask about Karlsruhe. The Constitutional Court this week cast aside a 2018 ECJ ruling that bond purchases are legal and ordered this proportionality assessment of the asset purchases. I wanted to ask all three policymakers whether they see a risk of the ECB's independent ability to execute monetary policy being impaired. Do they see a risk of that ability being impaired? And a question directly for Commissioner Gentiloni. What steps does the Commission believe now need to be taken? And in particular, do you see any role for infringement action being taken by the Commission? Thank you.
Thank you. On that, let me start by reminding everyone of the two principles that we must use at all times in dealing with European institutions. The first is the primacy of European Union law that guarantees the prevalence of European law over the national laws of the member states. And the second is one that is very close to our heart, which is the independence of the ECB, which is a basic principle of our economic and monetary union. So this is very important, and it was something that we also, of course, mentioned today in the meeting. And finally, let me remind you of what Christine Lagarde said yesterday. Namely that the ECB will continue doing whatever is needed, whatever is necessary, undeterred. And this is very important for us. Thank you.
Commissioner?
Yes. I fully agree with what Mario just said. I don't see any risk of the ECB being impinged in its independent action. As far as the Commission is concerned, we are studying the legal the reasoning of the German Constitutional Court in detail. Before we can consider the appropriate follow-up action taken in this matter. It should be clear that the Commission has a strong interest as guardian of the EU law in ensuring that both the Euro system and the Union Court system can at all times properly function and execute their respective mandates and roles as foreseen in the treaties.
Sorry, we were muted. Next question is from Athanasios from Greece. Athanasios, are you there? Great background.
Here, thanks very much. Thanks for the comment. And the question is the following. Did anyone ask the Commission why they did not present the official proposal with the details on the next fund, the recovery fund, this week, as the European Council decision clearly stated, 2 weeks. 2 weeks was now. So most likely we're moving for yet another week till we finally see the proposal. Did anyone raise this issue, and do you have a precise timeline when we are gonna see the final text, before or after your next Eurogroup meeting? Thanks.
Okay, perhaps Commissioner Gentiloni, would you like to have a go at this one?
Yes, in fact, nobody asked about, because I think it is clear that the Commission is working around the clock on this recovery plan and its funding, and I think that next week or the further one will be the right period to have this proposal on the table. But this is the President to decide.
Thank you. President Centeno, would you like to add something?
Yes, just to complement what the Commissioner said, from the side of the Eurogroup, of course, we are very much interested in the recovery phase. Of course, the recovery fund and the recovery plan are crucial and are pillars of our political action, common action to that. But we will take on that issue next week to debate among ministers on the challenges for the recovery phase, which needs a very strong coordination into the exit strategy of the confinement measures we all took during this sanitary crisis. And we are focused on two pillars for the recovery phase, to make sure that we can revive the single market in a way that is compatible with our economic strategies. This brings us all together for this challenge. And the same thing is true for the second pillar of this debate, which is the stability of the economic and monetary union, the financial stability, which also is absolutely key and again brings us all together in the same fight. So I don't see one without the other, and this is certainly something for the Eurogroup to discuss, and we will take it next week. Thank you.
Excellent. So now we pass on to Maria Psara from Euronews. Maria? We can't hear you. Yes, no.
What about now?
Yes, now good. Go ahead.
So I would like to insist a little bit more on the indirect costs. Could you give us some examples or any framework? I mean, supporting, for example, the income of workers and their insurance costs would be considered and as indirect cost. Have you discussed all that? Thank you.
The agreement is for the 2% to include as a benchmark, 2% as a benchmark, to include direct and indirect health-related costs with COVID-19. We kept precisely that in our agreement, and of course now it's for the member states to report and the Commission to evaluate, but this definition does not leave without an explicit reference to the size and meaningfulness of the instrument to fight this crisis. And they go together, and we all agreed that this should be exactly like that. Thank you.
If I may add.
Please, Commissioner, go ahead.
This only one point. I think we have to consider the fact that this outbreak produced a really enormous effort in most countries severely affected by the outbreak. So I think that the amount of resources that were mobilized and will be mobilized in the next months is really very, very high. I don't think that we will have strange calculations on this, because it will be, unfortunately, it is very clear that this is one of the main expenditures that many member states are having during this year. So I understand the fact that it could be not easy to define direct and indirect expenditures, but I am also aware of the fact that we are dealing with an enormous economic effort in member states connected to the pandemic.
And maybe I can add to that, that there's a very clear understanding that 2% of GDP can be made available for countries that request this facility. And it will not be difficult to show that the healthcare costs, direct and indirect, add up to that amount, because part of these healthcare costs will be the existing infrastructure and the cost of the general health system, because a lot of that has been diverted the last few months for the purpose of fighting the coronavirus. So that will be a big chunk of it. But in general, there was this clear understanding that the 2% will be made available.
President Centeno, thank you all for participating. I'm sorry we have to wrap this up. It's already almost an hour of press conference. I'll see you again next week as we have a Eurogroup set for Friday. Thank you. Bye-bye.